Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. I often tell the story of the tent revival that would come to town every year, and every year the town drunk would stumble in and come forward to the altar crying out, "Fill me, Jesus!" He did this every year, and when the revival left town, he would go back to his old habits. Finally, one year he came down the aisle yelling, "Fill me, Jesus!" And a lady in the back yelled out, "Don't do it, Lord. He leaks." Well, the fact is we all leak. We can be filled with faith, but over time it seems to leak out of us. That's why we need to read our Bibles and attend worship often, to be refilled and renewed in our faith. As we are spending time this week going through St. Paul's full story, perhaps this is a good time to talk about how Paul founded Christian churches in all those cities and towns he visited, and then he left to go to other towns and cities, and while he was gone, the people left behind started to leak. Not literally, but they began to misunderstand, distort, and get misguided by other preachers who were preaching a different gospel than what Paul preached. Eventually, someone would write Paul a letter about the situation, and Paul would write back and set them straight. Those churches saved his letters and passed them to other churches, and eventually they became part of our New Testament as Paul guided them into the right understanding of faith. These letters still guide us today. We left our story yesterday with Paul stopping his journeys for a time in the city of Corinth. It appears that around the year 52, Paul spent about 18 months in Corinth. There he met Prisca and Aquila, a married couple who became believers and who helped support Paul in his missionary journeys. Paul had been trained to be a tent maker, the same occupation Prisca and Aquila had, so there was a natural connection. The three of them left Corinth and made their way to Ephesus, where he founded one of the strongest and most influential churches of that time. Other sources even indicate that Mary, the mother of Jesus, and the Apostle John ended up there in Ephesus. Then Paul began his third missionary journey. He went through all the region of Galatia, mainly central and northern Turkey today, founding and correcting churches there. Then he came back to Ephesus and stayed there about 3 years, probably supporting himself by tent making. It is believed that Paul wrote his letters to the Corinthians and to the Philippians while he was in Corinth. Eventually, a local silversmith stirred up the people against Paul. The silversmith was a devotee of the Greek god Artemis, and because Paul was urging the people to have devotion to God, the silversmith was losing business because no one wanted his images of Artemis any longer. Paul left Ephesus and went back to Greece, probably staying in Corinth for a time, where he likely wrote a letter to the Christians in Rome. He continued visiting several cities and towns throughout Greece before finally heading back to Jerusalem. It is interesting to note that Paul did all this missionary work and telling others about Christ while at the same time being a tent maker. Perhaps we sometimes think that church work is and should be done by the professional church people like pastors and so on. But Paul didn't think that. Paul thought that the word of Jesus was for everyone in the midst of their daily lives. How has God called you to live out your faith in the midst of your daily activities? Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.